Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Vlog and Podcast. So we do this vlog and podcast every Sunday at 8 a.m. London time, and we really try to use it as an opportunity to sort of wrap up news and information that ZP's put out there this week. So something that we did this week is we actually did a survey on the number of papers that have actually been published using our micro biosensors. Now, the micro biosensors are something that I haven't overly spoken about on our vlog podcasts, on our webinars. This is a sort of technology that we do have. It was primarily developed for the neurosciences world, and what it involves is a little we call them kind of capillary electrodes, these little thin electrodes with diameters of electrodes of something like 25 microns or 50 microns. They're very small and they're used in a lot of, as I say, neuroscience studies. So they're sort of linked to molecules that are otherwise active in the brain. So ATP is everywhere. Adenosine triphosphate is everywhere in the body. It's the sort of the fuel or the power of cells. And we've got a biosensor for it. But what was pretty impressive for us was that actually it has so far been used, at least in the papers that we did a quick search on, in 36 papers. So thank you to the ZP team for essentially discovering that fact, and we did put those papers out there as well on our blog so that people could kind of go down and see the research that is done with these types of sensors. And we also put a video out there as well so people can get a sense of how to use these electrodes or microbiosensors in their studies. So some other news from ZP this week as well is it was just something that came up during one of our conversations. As you can appreciate at ZP, we do have a lot of technical conversations. We have very strong scientists, we have very strong engineers, we have very strong engineers with a quality perspective on them because we are ISO 13485. And so then you do find yourself actually checking out the definition of very simple words like repeatability versus reproducibility. Now, in spoken English, I just want to say hi to Ali. Nice to see you this morning, Ali. In spoken English, the word repeatable and reproducibility or reproducible are actually sort of interchanged, but they really mean something quite different. So if something's reproducible, let's say you did an experiment in your lab and you wrote down the method files and the equipment that you used and you put it in a scientific paper. If somebody then tries to do that experiment again, they're trying to reproduce your experiment. So reproduction can suggest it's not the same person in the same lab necessarily on the identical equipment. They're trying to reproduce the experiment. Whereas if you're in a lab and you have a sensor set up and you put the sensor into a sample, like say it's pH, and you get a signal, then you put the sensor back into the same sample and you get another signal, and then you put it in again. Now what you're doing is repeating. You're doing a repeated measurement essentially on the same equipment almost at the same time on the same sample. So there is a clear definition of the difference between repeatability and reproducibility. And it's important because obviously people do come to us and say, we want, sometimes they use the term reproducibility when they actually mean repeatability. Sometimes they use the word repeatability when they mean reproducibility. So there's a little confusion in the use of this word. But at ZP, we always kind of, when we find something interesting, let's say, and we realize, that needs to be some definition of that. Part of the remit of Zimmer Peacock is to, help the general biosensor community. And so we did put some information out regarding that. As I say, as things come along during the week, all these things are sort of relevant. The question comes up, how many ATP papers, adenosine triphosphate papers using the ZP sensor out there? We find out, we put the kind of information out onto the website. Is it clear that people understand the difference between repeatability and reproducibility when they're actually talking with these terms? And the answer is probably not, actually. Some other news that we put out there this week as well. What I like about the FoodSense is a technology from Zimmer Peacock. Now, what it's doing is it's taking what we call kind of point of care or point of need technology. So, a lot of diabetics in this world, unfortunately, they have to test their blood glucose 4 times a day. They prick their finger, they put a drop of blood on the glucose meter, um, and very rapidly they get a result of their glucose, and therefore they kind of know um, how well to control it. So most type 2 diabetics and type 1 diabetics, are expected to do this, as I say, 4 times a day. Slightly different matter, but most type 1 diabetics are going on to CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. But that said, at ZP, we do support a lot of clients in these kind of point of care, point of need technologies. But you'll also see that we're also taking this kind of technology and putting it into new applications. And so a new application, for example, would be measuring the hotness of chili sauces. Now, this week, to help, essentially help the clients, we've actually shown them how to test the hotness of a chili itself. Essentially, a chili sauce is really just a blended up chili in some things like vinegar and oils. And so, really, if you want to test the chili itself, it's really just a case of blend it up and put it into our buffer. But Solron just makes a good point in the video saying, in the video she weighed out something like 0.2, sorry, 0. I think it was 28 grams of the chili. So therefore, I think she put in something like 28 mils of the buffer, 28 milliliters of the buffer. She vortexed that together. Then she puts on a drop onto the sensor itself and then measures it. So what you can see is there that there's a bit of sample preparation, but the actual measurement itself is very akin to a point of care. And that's really the specialty, one of the specialties at Zimmer and Peacock. It's taking tests that otherwise were in a laboratory. So the other way of measuring Scoville heat units, there's generally sort of 4 ways of doing it. There's HPLC, high pressure liquid chromatography. It's an expensive kit. It's hard to run. It's hard to maintain. You need quite a lot of training. And actually, the results you get off it, especially in the measurement of capsaicin, they suffer from repeatability and reproducibility. They really suffer from it. So it's not actually that, let's say, accurate. So HPLC is one way of doing it. Something called the Scoville panel is another way of doing it, where you have a group of people, they're all tasting the chili, and you keep on diluting until they can no longer taste it. And the number of dilutions is used to calculate the Scoville heat unit. The other way of doing it is people are just having one person in the building test it. We had a demo recently where actually they even knew that they were shipping different batches out with different hotnesses. And then the other way is actually guessing. But in the video, we show that actually you can prepare and measure these chilies. And for example, I think our assay, let's say, the measurement time is about 60 seconds. So it's pretty rapid, much lower cost than running HPLC. And I think in that example, Solron got about 90,852 Scoville heat units. But it's just an example, really, of we do what we say we do, in terms of we say we develop point of care devices for people. Actually, you can see that we're also using it for doing food testing as well. But the nice thing about food testing is we can talk about it, where most of the work that we would do for clients, as you can appreciate, is under CDA, that's confidentiality agreements, and NDA, non-disclosure agreements. Some other news from Zimmer Peacock this week is we do have our ZP Developer Zone. ZP Developer Zone has got pretty long of recent. We've started even having to start the webinar slightly earlier of recent, because in fact last week I think we ran for 50 minutes. The week before it was something like 60 minutes. So we do get a lot of questions in, and we're quite happy to go through those questions. But as I say, there's a lot of those questions, and we do it. So every week we try to answer technical questions that come in from people really all around the world. Somebody wanted to fabricate a screen printed carbon electrodes. Somebody wants to detect heavy metals. Somebody wants to make a wearable pH sensor. Somebody wants to make an immunosensor for sepsis and bacteria. Somebody else wanted to make a ORP, an oxidation reduction potential. sensor. Some people wanted advice on gold electrodes. Cortisol is very popular. We do say to people, if you want to be involved in the cortisol sensor, we really have to get into a big program together. We also talked about, and I was very pleased with this question, we had a question come in from the YouTube channel about surface overpotential, ohmic overpotential, and mass transfer overpotential. So these are things that they're terms that are out there in the electrochemical industry community, and all these different terms which actually mean the same thing end up really confusing people. So we did try to put some clarity around that. We also discussed Easy Flex and where the manuals and the startup guides were. We did talk about a change in performance of a glassy carbon electrode. And that was really quite an interesting question, because in the end, when we dug into it, and the person had done some really excellent slides, they're basically drop casting polymer onto the surface of an electrode. I mean, and if that polymer gets into the electrode, it's going to turn it into, rather than being a conductive surface, an insulating surface. We did do a discussion on aflatoxins. We did do a discussion on analyzing chilies, and we also talked about ENIG, which is electroless nickel immersion gold, and we also talked about sodium sensors as well, our performance on sodium sensors. So it took me a long time to just say all of that, but that actually, that's all the materials that we covered. And we always kind of put in slides and try and put illustrations, so it's not just a monologue on these things. We do try to illustrate those answers quite deeply. Something else as well. I mean, I think this is quite nice that we have been invited to talk at a fairly prestigious conference. This is in Boston in May. It's kind of interesting because when I look at many of the speakers, actually I know these people. That's why obviously you do get invited. But it's being held in Boston at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and ZP will be talking really about the troubles or trials and tribulations of doing wearable biosensors. So I do look forward to speaking at that conference. So at the same time, then we're also saying we're going to reach out to people and say, look, we're in Boston. That's the East Coast USA, obviously, on the week starting 22nd of May. And if people want to meet up with us, they can meet up with us, or they can reach out to us then, and we can set up a meeting. So if I was to summarize things that we talked about this week, obviously, it's always at ZP, it's a mix of fundamental science and commercialization of science. And so our microbiosensors have actually made it into 36 publications. Great. We've, on the more sort of commercialization, getting that term repeatability and reproducibility properly defined, at least in the context of sensing. This is a mix, I would say, of science and commercialization, talking about how to measure a chili pepper in our food sense system. Obviously, the weekly webinar. If you've got any questions of Zimmer and Peacock and they're technical in nature, reach out to us and you'll probably find that we'll cover it in the weekly webinar. And I think in part thanks to all the work that we've done in wearables over the years, we've been invited to speak at a conference at MIT in May, and we're happy to sort of meet up with people in that Boston, East Coast area in the USA. So I'll finish it with that. I want to say special thanks to Ali, who's recently started kind of linking into us on social media and stuff, so we do appreciate it. So I'll say thanks very much, and I want you to have a good week, all of you. And don't forget, we do have our webinar on Thursdays at 8 a.m. London time, where we do more, let's say, more of a technical discussion. But that's the news from ZP for this week. Okay, thanks very much.